So this brings me to the concept of perspective. And this is another basic principle that we need to communicate, because we can have blood test results from one person, say it's your blood test results, and we can put it down in front of 3 or 4 different doctors. And depending on their training, we'll probably get 3 or 4 different impressions on what the numbers on the lab report means, even though the lab report is the same from each physician. Their perspective colors their interpretation. And to illustrate this, I'm just going to give you my paraphrase of an ancient Chinese parable. And this parable is called The Blind Man and the Elephant. And it goes like this. One day, several blind men who were blind from birth were asked to describe an elephant. And one person had his hands around the elephant's trunk, the other one was holding the tail, and a third had his arms wrapped around the elephant's leg. And of course, when they described the elephant, they gave completely different descriptions, yet the elephant is still the elephant. And this concept of perspective is really very important to us, because as I said before, I can take your blood chemistry report and I can guarantee you I'm going to see things in your blood chemistry that a conventionally trained medical doctor who is looking only for disease is not going to see. Why? Because my perspective is different. My training is different. My focus is on health and wellness. It doesn't mean that I ignore it when something says, hey doc, this person has got a disease process. What it does mean is that my first criteria is to look for where wellness is being lost. Where are you losing homeostasis, and which systems are out of balance, not necessarily to the point where they create or constitute a disease process, but to the point where you become symptomatic and you're actually suffering from that. And that perspective sometimes can make all the difference in the world. So here we have a representation of the fact that we're all designed for optimal health, and this is homeostasis. When we have homeostasis, we are well, we have vitality, we don't get sick, we have good energy, we have clear mind and clear thinking, and we sleep well. But as we lose homeostasis, which is what we're representing here by the arrow, we get into a state of dysfunction, and that really does begin when homeostasis is lost. And as we said earlier, if we continue to lose homeostasis, we get to the point where disease is inevitable unless we're able to restore that. Ideally, we want to catch somebody in that zone of dysfunction before they get to a disease process. It doesn't mean that if somebody's in the red zone, so to speak, that we can't help them. It just means that it's a little bit easier and results come quicker if we're just in the yellow zone of dysfunction. And ideally, we want to be able to use nutritional supplementation and diet and lifestyle changes, the cornerstones of natural medicine, to restore homeostasis and bring you back to that state of design for optimal health. The ultimate consequence, of course, if we can't do that, or if we don't do that, is that drugs and surgery become the most probable tools that you're going to have to use to recover from whatever it is you have. If even that corrects the problem, because as we said before, medications in many cases do nothing more than just cover symptomatology by working around a normal physiology and not requiring your body to restore function on its own. So let's come now to a concept of how do we establish priorities. We've talked about philosophy, and we've talked about some of the principles that underlie essential medicine and this approach. But let's talk about where do we start. More than 90% of my clients are chronically ill. They have multiple complaints, and they've been to see 3, 5, or 7 different doctors, lots of medical doctors, maybe a couple of alternative practitioners before they come to my door. And we start with this system of prioritization, and I think this is one of the things that distinguishes what I do compared to what many other physicians do, is that I actually have a plan of attack. And it's based on an orderly progression of function, and it's actually based on the imprint and design of that neuroendocrine immune system and how it orders and controls function from an above-down and from an inside-out process. So to illustrate this, let's talk about Stephen Covey. He's the author of 7 Habits of Highly Successful People and another book called The 8th Habit. In fact, he's written several best-selling books, and if you've never read his work, I would highly recommend it. In one of his books, he tells this story. A group of graduating business students asked a time management guru to lecture to them about managing time for success. Instead of lecturing to them, he placed a large glass jar on the table and said, "Today, we're going to do a demonstration project and then have a short quiz." He had a collection of large rocks on the table in front of him, and he said, "Our job is to put as many rocks in the jar as possible." He put one big rock in after the other, sometimes moving them around to make sure he could fit as many in as he could. When he could fit no more rocks in the jar, he asked the class, "Is the jar full?" The class said, "Yeah, you can't fit any more rocks in the jar." The guest lecturer said, "Really?" Producing a bucket of smaller rocks from under the table, which he proceeded to fit into the small spaces in between the big rocks. After a while, he asked the question again, is the jar full? This time, half the class said yes, and half the class said no. The guest continued to produce smaller rocks, then pebbles, and then sand, and finally he finished by pouring water in until it almost overflowed the jar. And when he truly couldn't fit anything else in the jar, he asked the class, well, what's the lesson? One guy in the back, and this is a typical North American attitude, put up his hand and said, if you try hard enough, you can always fit more in. And the lecturer shook his head and he said, no, the lesson is that if I had not started with the big rocks first, I never would have gotten them in at all. The bottom line principle is, of course, you make time for the important things in your life. You schedule those first. But we can take that principle of doing what's important first and actually translate that into your health and well-being. The bottom line is that certain aspects of human function and physiology are more important than others. And these form the foundation that health and well-being, your vitality or homeostasis, are based on. And a real-world example of that would be that you wouldn't build a house by starting with the roof. You have to build the foundation first. Then you frame in the walls and everything proceeds from there. And building health or recovering from ill health or loss of homeostasis is really actually no different. So let's talk about a basic concept in terms of looking at how we start with the foundation and really what's most important. Well, we can start with cell structure. We said earlier that healing and health comes from above down and from inside out, and really we're just a collection of cells. And if those cells can't maintain their structure, and that occurs, of course, through protein and healthy fats, then we can't have healthy cells and they don't work and do their job. Beyond that, the cells need to produce energy, and this is really where we start to dig into specifics, and we can do this with standard blood chemistry testing interpreted with a functional or a wellness focus. So if their cells don't produce energy, they don't do their prescribed job, and all cells have a specific job. So for example, a muscle cell contracts for movement, a liver cell produces enzymes and proteins, and your brain cells send electrical signals so that you can think and feel emotions. We also know that the cells need to control inflammation and free radicals. Inflammation and free radicals actually impair and eventually destroy cells, causing tissue degeneration and killing them. A simple example would be to go to your radio tomorrow and just tune your radio station one click off. And you might be able to still hear the music, but the static is going to interfere with the function of the radio. And that's what control of inflammation and free radicals is all about. Having inflammation and having free radicals, which damage your tissues and damage your cells, is like having static on the radio. Your cells will still be able to function, they just don't do it very well or do it very pleasantly. The next priority then is to actually make sure that all of the cells get turned on. And all of the cells in the body, including the brain, have what we can consider a master on switch. And these are actually turned on by thyroid hormones. And if you can imagine, just like our analogy of the car before, that if you have a very nice car in your driveway and you want to take a trip cross country, you've got the car, the oil has been changed, the car has been tuned up, the tires are inflated, there's gas in the tank, but you don't have your keys. Of course, you're not going to go very far. And likewise, when it comes to cellular function, if we can't turn the cells on, again, they can't do what they're designed to do. So the ability to turn cells on or activate them is also critically important for us. And then our final priority is to make sure that the cells communicate with each other. And human function is nothing if it's not completely integrated. That means everything works in connection with everything else. And as a result, when we do evaluations, we can never look at any part of human function as something that is complete and distinct or separate from everything else. We have to assess any test that we do in conjunction with all other tests that we do. And that just makes good sense. And the cell-to-cell communication, of course, is most critically important when we go back and revisit that concept of neuroendocrine immune function, that master control system. Again, our sense of health and well-being, our ability to heal from injury and insult, comes from the ability of our brain or our nervous system and our hormones and the immune system to talk to each other.